And we're seeing that. And we're seeing that especially in the United States, and we're seeing that especially in general in the Southeast and in this area, so that overall there has been an increase in very heavy rainfall events in the U.S. by 20% over the last 100 years or so. And most of that occurred since 1970. That's the top 1%. There's also more water vapor in the atmosphere, which enhances the greenhouse effect, and so there's increased warming associated with that. Precipitation in general is also changing around the world. Here I've just sorted out a number of areas, and at the top here are all of the ones which are significantly showing increases in precipitation, and it includes all of the United States and southern parts of Canada, Northern Europe, Northern Asia, and Central Asia. And then there are other parts of the world, mainly in the all throughout Africa, Southern Europe, Southern Asia, Southern Africa, that there are significant decreases going on. Now these are not simple, they're not a straight line. You can see this is in the Sahel region in Africa, for instance. But in general, there have been these decreases that are occurring, and there are patterns of change in where the storms tend to occur, so that there's more at high latitudes and there's a bit less in the tropics and in the subtropics. Notice Africa in particular here. Notice also in the U.S., and there's one arrow there that's pointing almost to this area. This is eastern North America. So here's the change, and you can see, things were going along, and then it got quite a bit wetter somewhere after about 1970 in general. I'll say more about that in a minute. The other thing that we can look at, as I mentioned before, is we can look at the very heavy rainfall events, the 95th percentile and 99th percentile. And in general, we see that most places around the world, when it rains harder now than it used to. There are a few places where there's decreases, but these are also places where the overall precipitation is decreasing, so there's not even enough to really do that. But most places around the world, when it rains now, it rains harder than it used to. And that's especially true in the U.S. Another consequence of the warming is that more precipitation falls as rain rather than snow, and the snow melts faster. And so in the mountain areas around the world, and this includes also even plains areas, maybe that's not high, but they're in the middle of continents, if there's more rain and the snow melts faster, then the runoff occurs in rivers sooner. And so in the western parts of the United States, Columbia River, for instance, the runoff is now peaking somewhere around 7 to 10 days earlier than it did 35 years ago in 1970. The snowmelt is very important for many ecosystems. Snowmelt typically occurs in the late spring, early summer. The rivers are at their peak somewhere typically around June. And this provides a lot of water for the greening up of the planet in the spring. If there's less snow and less snowmelt, or it occurs earlier, so that instead of occurring in May, it occurs in March or April, it means that there's less water as we go into the summertime in the soil moisture. And if there's less soil moisture, that means there's less evaporation, and we go into the summer increasing the risk of drought, because the weather systems that we have in the summertime are more like thunderstorms, more local weather systems. They don't reach out as far to gather the moisture as they do in winter, where you have major storms that are producing snowstorms in the Ohio, for instance, where the moisture is coming out of the tropical Atlantic or the Gulf of Mexico. But in the summertime, a lot more of the local evaporation gets recycled, so to speak. And so if there's less moisture in the ground because there's been less snowpack, as you go into the summer, the risk of drought increases, and along with it, the risk of fires. This was actually the Hayman wildfire near Denver in 2002, where something like 400 houses burned. And of course, we've seen that now recently in California, and this drought in the southeast. The risk of wildfire goes along with that. This is the overall change in drought around the world. as estimated. This is the predominant pattern, and it has this time series attached to it. So there's an overall upward trend in this, especially a jump in the early 1980s. And so since this is going upwards and it goes with this pattern, the orange and red colors on here therefore correspond to increasing drought. And so you see increasing drought, especially throughout Africa, southern Europe, southern parts of Asia, Australia, even in the Brazil, especially in the northeast part of Brazil, so this is a little bit out of the Amazon, and in the northern parts and also in the southwestern parts of the United States, northern parts of North America. A few areas where this is not showing up here is in the east of the Rockies and down in Argentina and also in parts of northern Europe. This increase here comes about from two effects. The dominant one is a change in the patterns of rainfall, and so more rainfall is now occurring over the ocean than is over the land. And some of this is related to the phenomenon known as El Nino. And so in that case, you have a lot of rainfall going out over here at the expense of drought in Africa and Brazil and Australia and Southern Asia and so on. And that's a part of what's going on. But another part of it is increased evaporation, increased demand of the atmosphere, full water vapor, sucking moisture out of the ground because the air is warmer. So that's associated with the overall warming of the planet. So when we do get a drought, for natural reasons, the droughts tend to be more intense. They set in a little quicker. The plants wilt a little longer. Global warming itself is not causing the droughts. What it's doing is it's making the droughts that occur naturally more intense, last a little longer. This is just to summarize this part of the talk. This is Lake Powell in the southwest. There are two big lakes that are used as reservoirs now. Lake Powell, this is Lake Powell. It's a very fascinating lake. And you can see around the edges here, there's sort of a watermark, a bathtub ring. And up until 1999, Lake Powell was full, and then there was a drought in the southwest, and the water levels dropped by over 100 feet. In 2004, there was a little bit of relief. It's gone up about 10 feet or something like that since then. But in general, even though agriculture recovered, so there's no agricultural drought as such, the hydrological drought, the overall long-term storage in the ground and in lakes, that still exists in the southwest. And of course, you've seen evidence of that in California, in Southern California, even from the standpoint of agriculture. And also now there is a major drought in the southeast here. And so rising greenhouse gases are causing climate change. Arid areas are generally tending to become drier. So this includes places like Africa and Australia. Has consequences in Australia. They just had a new government and a change in prime minister, very much as a part of the consequence of the drought and climate change issues in Australia. Water management then is, I think, one of the main issues associated with climate change. And it ought to be of concern to you here as well. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. What about heat waves and wildfires? This next slide is one of my favorite slides to illustrate the nature of climate change and what it really means. The neat thing about Europe is that they have measurements of temperature going back into the 1700s. And so going back to 1780 here, there's estimates of Central Europe temperatures in summertime, in June, July, August. That's what this is.